Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the State Library of New South Wales. I'm Stephen Romay, the literary editor and film critic for the Australian newspaper. Before we get going, I will start with Welcome to Country. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on country this evening. We are currently on Gadigal land, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. So I'm here tonight with the writer Peter Fitzsimons, whose new book, which you can see here, is on the well-known Breaker Morant. It's published by Hachette and is available in all good bookstores, including the State Library of New South Wales. With us is Bruce Beresford, who I don't think I'm exaggerating to say is one of Australia's greatest film directors. And in 1980, he made a film of Breaker Morant that won 10 Australian Film Industry Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director. It was a film that did not direct itself, and several other leading categories. So we're here tonight to talk about Peter's book, Bruce's film, and the thing that holds them all together, which is the Boer War and Harry Harwood Morant. We'll start with Peter. Now, Peter, you say in the book that there is a personal element to this story for you. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about that. And given that you're someone who's covered so much of Australian history, so many big names like James Cook, Burke and Wills, Ned Kelly, Douglas Mawson, given you had this personal connection to the story, why did it take you so long to come around to writing about the Boer War and Breaker Morant?
Thank you, Stephen. It's an honour to be on the stage with the great Bruce Beresford. No, I mean that. I love it. But anyway, just thank you very much for having me. My grandfather, Frederick Harper Booth, I always grew up from a little boy. Mum and Dad had been in the Second World War and Grandpa had been in the Boer War. And I talked to Grandpa about it a little bit, but never much. He died when I was about 12 years old. But then my brother, when I started doing Second World War, I thought, geez, this is a good war to write about, because it's so easy to work out where good and bad lies, because you've got the Holocaust on one side. Okay, we know which is the evil side here, and you can write about the good side. And I always thought I'd ignore the First World War. But then when I got into it, the story of Pozieres is an extraordinary story. The Battle of Le Hamel, the story of Gallipoli, they're great stories. And Boer War was sort of, what was that about again? That was, I didn't have a strong grasp of what it was about. And then I was on the council of the War Memorial for a couple of terms, which I think was 8 years. And I voted for, and my brother, James, said to me, you've got to write about Grandpa. It's your family duty. And I ignored it. And then I was on the council of the War Memorial. I voted there should be a memorial, a statue for the Boer War veterans. And then I was off. Tony Abbott took over, and everybody that had been appointed by a Labor government had to leave the War Memorials. See you later. Thanks very much. And in 2017, I go down for the opening of the War Memorial, and it's 300 metres down from the War Memorial itself on that, coming out of the bush, 4 bronzed horsemen with their horses, plaque in the front. And I walk towards the plaque, and the plaque is the letter from a trooper, and writing to his mother about what it's like to be on the front lines. And I, reading the plaque, I think, this sounds familiar. And written by Trooper Frederick Harper Booth, 2nd Mounted Rifles Victoria, writing to Maria Sophia Craigie Macpherson Dunbooth. That was my grandfather writing to my great-grandmother. So by pure happenstance, absolute fluke, I had nothing to do with it. There is my grandfather writing that. We had all the diaries, we had all the letters, so it gave me the opportunity to write about Grandpa. That started me on the trek of doing the Boer War with Breaker Morant, who's the most famous episode. Turns out that Grandpa, when I go through the diaries and the letters and I cross-reference, was in one of the battles with Breaker Morant, and Grandpa was a pretty good writer. So I was able to make, and Sydney-siders may know Bridge Street, 44 Bridge Street, which is Booth House, which is an 8-storey Art Deco building that he built in 1932. Family sold it in 1970 for $1 million. Good move. Lost it all. And so I talked to all my brothers and sisters and my 26 cousins. What do you remember about what Grandpa told you about the Boer War? And the most compelling story was my brother Andrew in 1969 was the CUO of the Cadet Corps, and turns up at Grandpa's house when Grandpa was 92 years old. Grandpa opens the door. There is this beautiful young man, my brother Andrew, in a military uniform. Grandpa looked at him and burst into tears for the men that he knew 70 years earlier that never came home.
So it's quite obvious that good writing runs in your genes.
Oh, well, but it was a great thing for me to bring Grandpa to life. And one of the more confronting things is, as Bruce covers it in the film, but it was very tough when Kitchener basically said, we're going to burn them out, because what happens is the two Boer republics revolt against the Brits in South Africa. It was two bands of white fellas fighting over black fellas' land, and the black fellas, the Africans, very rarely get a look in. I tried to, as much as possible, bring in their experience because they're never sort of mentioned. But Kitchener says we'll just burn them out, and they burnt down 30,000 Boer homesteads, and to deny the Boer fighters that were living off the land, to deny them the chance to keep going. And, you know, I think it was April 2nd, 2001, Grandpa's account, writing to my great-grandmother, said, well, Mum, I've had a tough day. We had to burn down these households, and the women were crying and the children were crying, but it's tough duty. But look, we've got to do it because we've got to finish this war. And it's, you know, I wasn't confident that my grandpa was on the right side of the equation in that, as a good a man as he was.
As Peter says, Bruce, Boer War, to talk about it to most people, particularly in 1980 perhaps, Breaker Morant has become more sort of celebrated since. And they would think it was a story about pigs fighting or something like that. So what was it that inspired you in 1980 to make a film about this war in South Africa?
Well, there were a few factors. I mean, one was that I had known a little about Breaker Morant because he lived around the Hawkesbury area and wrote for the Richmond Windsor Gazette. My parents lived there. And they said to me, oh, that house over there, the famous Breaker Morant lived there. And I used to say, well, who was he? And then I did a little bit of checking, and I found out, you know, that he'd been in the Boer War. I didn't find out all these horrible things because he was largely regarded as a hero. And then someone at the South Australian Film Corporation said to me, did I know about Breaker Morant? Would I be interested in a film? And they sent me a script which was written for another producer, which wasn't that great, but it was a story, and also a play. And so I wrote a new script based partly on the play, but not great. In fact, I don't think that play was ever performed, but some of the play had some good dialogue and I used it. The other script I didn't. There were a number of other scripts floating around, and I said to them, look, this isn't going to work. I've got to do more research because this is all chaos. I wanted to go to Pretoria, but in those days it was apartheid and they wouldn't let me go. So I went to London and I did research in the Imperial War Museum. And I was right up in the roof, and they gave me a whole lot of letters and documents and diaries from the Boer War. And I was there for a couple of weeks reading all that stuff. And that gave me a lot of information. Not as much information, I suppose, as Peter found out, and that's in that book. But I did then change my mind about Morant being a great hero. I realized the situation was very complicated, that he was a very disorganized sort of guy. He was a poet and a horseman, but he was a drunk and a thief. And then when he was in South Africa in the Boer War, he broke down. I mean, I put a speech in the script that's delivered by Jack Thompson very well. It's a 5-minute speech that Jack did in one long take. He did it brilliantly. And I put dialogue in that which really summed up my point of view, which was everyday life had disappeared. The stresses were great. The men could no longer behave as rationally as they should have. Everything went wrong, and he ended up killing prisoners. In fact, I realized from Peter's book that his behavior was far worse than I imagined when I wrote the film script.
May I ask? I loved the scene in the film where he says, when the English prosecutor says, and this drumhead court-martial, was it a court-martial like this? Like this? No, it wasn't like this. There were no chairs. And he gets to that famous scene where he says, we got them and we shot them under Rule 303. When you found that transcript, were you just, eureka, this is gold?
Oh, yes,
That's
because
what
it
happened.
it is exactly what happened. It's so dramatic. And the other thing that I found in one of the letters when I was in the Imperial War Museum was a letter from one of the members of the firing squad who wrote and said, we shot these two Australians and they walked towards the chairs hand in hand.
God, that was beautiful.
And I thought, oh my God. And I put that in the film script. And then the producers at the South Australian Film Corporation said, oh, everyone will think they're gay. And I said, nobody's going to think they're gay.
And that is such a beautiful scene. And it's exactly what happened. This strange intimacy on the last night of their lives. Peter Hancock, who was Lieutenant Peter Hancock, who was a sad soul and did whatever Morant told him to do. And he was the worst of the murderers that actually did it. And on the final night of his life, he's got a wife and 3 children. He doesn't write to them, but he does write to his sister, whereas Breaker Morant is dashing off brilliant poetry, writing these extraordinary letters. And then the scene that I most love, although this was not in the film, but I was only turned up by one of my researchers, which is an exquisite part of it, that the final, do you want your last cigarette? So he takes out the cigarette case and he puts it in, and then he offers the silver cigarette case to the major that's in charge of the firing party. And here is the exquisite detail. Stephen, if you and I were about to be shot by Bruce, and he says, all right, here's your last cigarette, and we're going to shoot you when you finish, we would smoke that down till our fingers burnt. But the extraordinary elan of, if that's the word I'm looking for, of Breaker Morant, he gets halfway through and he flicks it away. And that for me is an exquisite detail. Let's get on with it. And, the famous line which you should deliver, shoot.
Shoot straight, you bastards. Don't make a mess of it.
Don't make a mess of it.
Of course, part of the thing about that, it was superbly photographed by Don McAlpine, but Brian Brown and Edward Woodward carried the scene off so superbly. I mean, even when they walked away from the camera and they held hands, you could feel the emotion. You could feel almost the love between them and the fact that they were there together.
And one of his final poems was to Dear Peter. Dear Peter, no more loyal man than you.
Edward Woodward recorded, I mean, we had verses from the poem through the last 10 minutes of the film, which were tremendously effective. And Woodward was such a great actor. I remember when I gave him the poem, he said, you're lucky I'm in this film, Bruce. He said, no one else could make this poem sound good.
And the interesting thing, here we are at the State Library. Now, Banjo Patterson's offices, I think we're in Market Street. And in 1894, Banjo Patterson's an acclaimed journalist, but he's starting to get attention for his poetry. And he gets a letter from his uncle up Queensland Way. And it's a wonderful letter. It says, Dear Banjo, I'm sending this bloke towards you. This is six years before the Boer War broke out. I'm sending this bloke towards you. His name's Breaker Morant. I don't know what's wrong with this fellow. He's always in trouble. He's always in fights. His debt's everywhere, but you'll be interested to meet him. 3 weeks later, an answer came directed in a writing unexpected. And I think the same was written with a thumbnail dipped in tar. Banjo looks up and there's this guy towering over him, says, G'day, my name's Breaker Morant. And they have this fabulous afternoon together where Breaker Morant is telling Banjo Patterson these amazing stories of all these extraordinary stories from the country and, of candles on either side of a gate at midnight and taking bets and jumping the horse over, all the stuff that Banjo loves. Banjo loves him. And at the end of it, Breaker Morant says, look, I haven't got my wallet. Could you give me 5, 10 pounds? And Banjo Patterson, remembering what his uncle says, actually no. But they kept in touch thereafter. And when I started writing the book, I wanted Breaker Morant to be Banjo. I wanted him to be the man from Snowy River, cruelly put up against the wall by those English bastards, because, as you said in your very kind review, that would have suited my politics. And it's an easy story to tell, but the truth of it is, A, he was an Englishman, B, he was a bastard, C, he was a murderous, an almost a psychopathic psychopathic bastard, in the final atrocities that he does, there is a Boer father with two sons, one of them, I think, 12 years old, who's crook. And Breaker Morant gives the orders to his henchmen. He had three with him, one of whom was Hancock, and he says, when I say lay down arms, shoot them. And so these three, the father and the two sons, realize, like, the wind's changed. We're surrendering here. We want to be taken to the camp, but they're looking at us. And Breaker Morant says, all right, lay down your arms. They visibly relax, at which point the three men go up, bang, 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 shoot three of them dead. Now, show me that to defend.
Until you told that story, however, everything you two just said about Breaker Morant, his dash, his elan, his style, his humour, his relationship with Banjo Patterson, etc., you can see why, after all these years, it's still so difficult to persuade people out there that he was a murderous psychopath.
Yes. Well, I mean, in the film, I think if I'd done it in such a way that he was basically innocent and railroaded, everyone would have been quite happy. But I didn't see that even then, even though I didn't have access to the research that you had. I had enough to show me that the behavior was absolutely shocking. And that what I did was put it in a context where life was different. I mean, he was in a war situation. I think he says at one point, or I had Jack Thompson say, you're fighting people and they're not in uniform. You don't know if they're friends or enemies. Everything's wrong. You can't tell. You're constantly on your guard. That was really the only defense there was. Not ultimately, of course, that it meant for a moment that he was innocent, far from it.
And yet that sick 12-year-old boy, and the other one was the Reverend. There was the Reverend Daniel Heese. And you only need to know about this Reverend, this pastor who was with the German Missionary Society. Morant felt that there was a risk that this man would dob them in for effectively, because
that was in the film. I put it that yes, they believed that this guy, the missionary, was in fact taking information back and forth, and he sent Hancock out to shoot him.
And there was no way, there was no fear that he was an enemy combatant. There was no chance that he had a pistol under his smock. And it was a brutal murder of a good man with two children, and he was trying to get back to his daughter. His baby daughter was about to turn 2, and Morant had him shot by Hancock.
So given that, why do you think then it is so difficult still to convince the public opinion that this is what he did and that he deserved to be executed?
Well, I think Peter's convinced them now. I think the book is so well researched and so written with such flair that you can't possibly read it and not be convinced totally that everything in it is exactly accurate, that Morant was really as monstrous as you're stating.
Thank you. And there are people still out there who want him to be given a posthumous pardon. To them, I say, camera one on me. Here is a guy that was in charge of this unit, the Bushveld Carbineers. The first person that Morant felt was going to be the first person in the unit. Morant hadn't got there at this point, but there was one fellow that was felt he's going to dob us in. He took a bullet to the head. Okay, Hancock shot him. Okay, the next one was Daniel Heese. Okay, the pastor Daniel Heese. He took a bullet to the head and was shot, as was his African boy. So here are 3 people that are at risk of dobbing in. The first one, Morant wasn't threatened directly, but the Bushveld Carbineers were. But the next 2, Morant was directly threatened. So there were 15 men in his unit who got together, who said, we're decent, we're honourable. We did not come to this war to shoot children. We did not come to this war to shoot unarmed combatants. Those 15 men, with the example of 3 corpses before them with a bullet in their head, of this is what happens to those who complain. These 15 men had the courage to sign the letter to the colonel to say, this man, Morant, is presiding over this. This is an atrocity. This is on your watch. You have to arrest them. So if we're going to honour anybody, and those that say that he should be given a pardon, and those that say that the court-martial didn't have its T's crossed and its I's dotted and da-da-da-da-da, answer me this. Why did those, if this was a good man, if this was a man that deserved a pardon, why did those 15 men there at the time in his unit sign that letter at the risk of their lives?
That's a very strong point in the book. That was something that in my research I never found out about. So that was one of the most interesting aspects of that book, that those men reported on Morant back to Pretoria. It's a bit similar, I suppose, to this scandal, terrible thing that's going on now in Afghanistan.
Well, we'll talk about that because it is directly comparable, I would think. They're Australian soldiers in a place far away that they probably don't know why the war is being fought half the time. And so we've now got in the headlines now this sort of dagger in the heart. And it's at the moment accusations only of Australian soldiers in Afghanistan shooting unarmed people, just as Breaker Morant did. Yet, I would suggest, a bit like Breaker Morant, the weight of public opinion is nowhere near 100% saying this needs to be investigated, this is terrible. I would say it's split, perhaps even favouring the military. A lot of people have the idea that war is hell, bad stuff happens. How can you blame these men who are on a literal hair trigger of being killed themselves from responding the way they do? Now, that's just some thoughts for you to talk about.
You will have seen Four Corners where the fellows with the helmet and they've got the camera, and we can witness one of those Afghanis being killed, and the fellow shouts out to his commander, "Do you want me to drop this?" Rhymes with runt. Remember the scene? Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Peter and Bruce, what I'm trying to get at is that, as with Breaker Morant, there might be a gap between what happened and what the public thinks.
Well, it's inevitably true. I mean, people aren't they backing Australian soldiers and can't believe that they would behave that badly, that there are stresses and pressures on them, and probably if you understood the circumstances you would come to the conclusion that, well, maybe it's not that bad because after all they are at war and you've got to kill the enemy. But I think you've got to draw a line between fighting soldiers in combat and shooting non-combatants. I mean, it's appalling. It's
appalling.
Shocking.
And they're wearing our uniform, and they're allegations only, and we will let the due process take its part. But I admire institutional Australia, who has said, they've gone through the whole thing and said, right, this is serious enough that we will launch serious investigations. And the Prime Minister's words, I think, were, "This will shock Australia." It has shocked Australia, but who I honour, if these allegations are proven true in due judicial process, the ones that need to be honoured are the decent, honourable soldiers who said, no, this is not what we're doing. And the stories of, if they're proven, of newbies, new soldiers arriving. Here's young Stephen, he's 21 years old, he's just arrived from Duntrin. Well, son, you're going to have to prove yourself. You're going to have to shoot this unarmed prisoner. If those stories are proven true, who defends that? I mean, we're Australians, we don't do that. And we have a proud Anzac tradition. And those who are most honouring the Anzac tradition are those who are saying, no, we're decent, we're honourable, we wear the Australian uniform, and we're following the rules of engagement. Because if they're not following the rules of engagement, there's no difference between them and a murderous mob. The ones we need to honour are those who are standing up for decency, if indeed these allegations are proven true.
I remember being shocked many years ago when I heard, I was very young, I think I was only about 12, and I heard these men talking who were soldiers, had been fought in New Guinea in the war, who were friends of my uncle who had fought in New Guinea. And I heard them saying that they had shot Japanese prisoners. And I remember being absolutely appalled at that age and thinking, why would they shoot prisoners? I
Mm.
mean, and then they were saying, oh, well, we couldn't do anything with them, and all that kind of stuff.
There was
I
a
was stunned.
there was a Kokoda documentary, and there was a fellow of the 39th Battalion, and his name was Smokey Howson. It was a brilliant documentary done 50 years after Kokoda, and he told this story that Japanese ambush, one of the Japanese prisoners is left behind, and the lieutenant said, "Smokey, finish him off." And the Smokey says, and I put my 303 down to his head, and his eyes were looking up at me, and then he paused and he said, "And those eyes have been looking at me for 50 years." And appalling stuff. And again, people that defend what's happening talk about, the suicide rate, we're putting too much pressure on these young men. People like Smokey Howson, who were told to do that kind of stuff, it haunted them for the rest of their lives. As decent Australians, we want, you cannot have a culture that, as has been described, that if that is proven true, that is appalling. There's no excuse for it, and we need to act.
There's a similarity too, isn't there, in that Morant, Hancock, Whitten, they were lieutenants.
I can't remember what they were now. They were something. Yeah.
Yes, Lieutenant Morant, Lieutenant Whitten. Yep.
Yeah. And in Afghanistan, the people accused, they're non-commissioned officers, I suppose.
NCOs, yeah.
NCOs, right? And so I suppose on one level that can make you, as you say, the military has responded very directly to what's happened.
And admirably.
Yeah, and admirably. And it can give you some, I don't know if hope's the right word, that it's a group of middle ranking officers or non-commissioned officers, not direction from the top.
I must say, the fellow at the top, the general, whose name escapes me at the moment, the haunted look in his eyes also gives me hope, because he's absolutely shocked. He does not look like a man that knew this was going on. He just looks like, this is happening on my watch. We've got to root this out.
It's become a tremendous issue, because we've got a VC winner involved. Roberts, yes, it's... you can see why the thing has become such a big deal.
He's also taking legal action against the Nine Network, I believe, for what they've reported on him. So we should be careful.
Yes, well, of course.
We've got to be careful on the whole thing. We're not prejudging anybody.
No, we can't prejudge the inquiry. They'll do it.
So let's return to the film for a moment, because I have some questions I'd like to ask you, Bruce. Was Edward Woodward your first choice to play Harry Morant?
Oddly enough, yes, but for not a very good reason. Because I had a photograph of Morant, one of the ones that's in your book, actually, and I looked at it and I thought, who does he remind me of? And then I thought, I know, he looks like that English actor, Edward Woodward, who I'd seen in Callan. Remember the series Callan?
Still one of the best
and
television
I thought,
shows.
He's such a great actor. So I said to the people at South Australian Film Corporation, let's send him the script. So in those days, you could do that sort of thing much easier than you can now. So we posted him the script. Next thing, I got a phone call and he said, this is very good. He said, I'd love to come to Australia and play this role. And it was as simple as that. But I knew he was a fine actor because I'd actually seen him in a few other things as well. But that was really the basis of it.
How was your, if I may ask, how was your film received in South Africa? I mean, we loved it in Australia. Did they love it in South Africa or not?
I believe they did. I got a number of calls and letters at the time it was released there. I remember getting a call once in the middle of the night from somebody in Bloemfontein or Petersburg or somewhere, and he said, look, we're all seeing your Breaker Morant film. They said, we want to know, where did you shoot it? Was it near Bloemfontein or was it near Petersburg? We're having a big argument about it. I said, it was shot in South Australia.
Is that right? The whole thing was shot in South Australia?
Yes.
Did you shoot it in 6 weeks or something?
Oh, we did it in 32 days. It
Did
was
you really?
Very fast shoot, yes. Because the budget was not huge. It was tight, and everybody worked very, very hard to get it done. But we put a title on it, filmed on location in SA, which is South Australia, but people thought it was South Africa.
I have one other casting question to ask you while we're on the subject. You mentioned before that if you had Morant and Hancock holding hands, people might think they were gay. So I need to ask you, are you the only director to have got Brian Brown to wear a moustache?
I can't remember how the moustache. I think I did ask him to wear the moustache. Yes, Brian. He was very cooperative. He's a fabulous actor.
The interesting thing too, Breaker Morant, not only not gay, although, well, you know, well, if he was gay, good luck to him.
No, if he
No,
was,
neither
we
here nor
wouldn't
there, but
mind,
he was very ungay in terms of his sharing his favours with women. But the first woman that he married, in fact, I think the only woman he married, was none other than Daisy Bates, and who went on to fame as a, how would you describe Daisy Bates? One of the pioneers in Indigenous.
Yes, I mean, she lived among a group of Aborigines in South Australia for the rest of her life. I mean, she was sort of helping them.
And her marriage to Breaker Morant lasted mere weeks before she went, I'm out of here.
Yes, it was in, as I said in
1882
my,
from memory.
when I wrote about your book, I had not been able to find out that she was married. I'd heard that rumor that she was married to Breaker Morant, but you found evidence.
Well, that's right, Bruce. You wrote in that review of Peter's book for the Australian that you learned a lot of things that you hadn't known before from Peter's book. And it makes me ask more generally about the amount of research that a subject like the Boer War and also this individual must take. At what point do you decide you've done enough?
It's very interesting. My brother was a builder, and I used to be a labourer on his building sites, and he said, Pete, when you're getting next to the end of a project, you've got to say this is the date and it's done. And my publisher is in our audience of 300 or 400 people here, and he and I always have a blue at the end when I don't want to let go of it. But I am privileged and blessed to have serious researchers, and on this one I had to, Dr. Peter Williams, Dr. Libby Effany, Angus, my cousin Angus Fitzsimons, Barbara Kelly, and they're serious researchers, two of them with PhDs, one in military history. And I start from a position of profound ignorance, and I like to use my ignorance as a tool, and I like to go wide on context. To tell a story, when I did Tobruk, the story of Tobruk, I go, well, here's this dot on the map, Tobruk. Why were we Australians were there? Why were the Germans there? And you start from like large concentric circles in the first chapter, and every chapter you're getting closer and closer to the heart of the story. But in this one, and I've got a problem at the moment with the Opera House on the book I'm doing at the moment, so much material to narrow it down. It's so fabulous. And with Breaker Morant, what I broadly wanted was the Boer War, the context of the Boer War, what that was all about. I wanted who Breaker Morant was all about, and then to get into the atrocities. But I was fascinated some of the battles, the early battles, and then people that have read the book, a lot of people come back to me about the Battle of Ellen's River, which was at Gallipoli before Gallipoli, and you had 300 Australians with some Brits, some Rhodesians on top of a small hill, surrounded by 3,000 Boers, and they've got the guns, and they're pounding and pounding and pounding for days on end. The Australians had Queensland coal miners who knew how to dig, so in the first night they're digging and they're digging and they're getting under the ramparts and they're surviving. And they come out and one bloke loses his leg, and they amputate him, and they put him under some chloroform, and he comes to and he says, where's my leg? Oh, we buried it. Well, you're going to have to undig it. Why? You're going to have to dig it up. Why is that? Because I've left 10 pounds in the pocket. And this goes for days. And then this Boer emissary comes in from the Boer general and says, we've got you surrounded. We've got 3,000 men. You've got 500 men. Talking to the English colonel, you're going to have to surrender. If you lay down your arms, we'll give you free passage out of here. We want your guns and your ammo. We want your supplies, but you can go. And I love the English colonel's reply. He says, you don't understand. I'm commanding Australians up on the top of that hill. Even if I wanted to surrender, and I don't. But if I did, if I went back up that hill and I told those Australians that I'd surrendered, they would slit my throat. Then when you go to the diaries and the letters of the Australians there at the time, he's right. They would have. And there was one Queensland captain who says, basically, if that bastard surrenders, we'll fight our way out. And I do love that. That's a bit hairy-chested, that kind of stuff. But it happened. It absolutely happened.
It's one of the most exciting parts of the book, actually, the description of that battle, because I had read a large number of books about the Boer War, but that's the only one I've read that I thought was really giving you all the information, but it was thrilling.
Thank you. I really appreciate your review.
Characterization and detail.
And if I may say, I really appreciate your review because you get it, what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is to tell a story story with serious researchers to say, I mean, I always say the difference between fiction and non-fiction is this, that when you're reading fiction, it's fabulous, but there's a little voice which says, this didn't happen. There was no Miss Havisham. There was no wedding cake. There was no Pip. There was no Estella. What I want to do is do non-fiction stories where you're reading true stories, and instead of the little voice which says this didn't happen, you get a big voice and you say, this happened. And how do we know it happened? I'll tell you how we know it happened, because I've got 2,000 footnotes to taking to original documents and transcripts that says this is what happened. And so what I loved about your review, apart from your kindness, was you get it. You get what I'm trying to do. And I've been helped along the years by many strong academics, who really serious academics, who've helped me, who've been very kind to me. Occasionally academics don't get it. I live with it, but you got it, and I thank you. And I thank you, by the way, because you've been very kind to me over the years. Not everybody at the Australian's been kind to me over the years, but you have.
Well, I've always been a supporter of your work, Peter. I think that what you do is you bring Australian history alive to a lot of readers, and one hopes to a younger generation of readers who deserve to know more about Australian history. And that's something that you have in common, strangely enough. You write in the present tense. You write your histories in the present tense. A film, of course, is in the present tense. You bring it, it's not an old thing. It's right now in both of your works. And you can live in the same kind of atmosphere as the people involved.
It took me 25 years to get to that realization of the present tense. I used to want to say, come close to me at the campfire while I tell you a story. Once upon a time, long ago, there was a man called Breaker Morant. What I now want is, forget me, forget the campfire. I want to have what I call with my researchers the FD, the fine detail, to bring a scene to life, to put the reader in the middle of the story. So you forget everything else, and I work on parallel narratives. So you're having one narrative of one part of the story and the other part of the exactly as films do.
So that's interesting. Bruce, you had to do the film, as you said, in 6 weeks. I think you said it was something like that. You did the research beforehand, of course, but it was a tight.
Yeah, I researched the film for the best part of a year.
But the shoot was a tight shoot.
Yes.
And that's it. It has to be done. 40 years later, with everything you've learned since, and with Peter's book, is there anything that you would do differently if you made the film today?
Probably, having read Peter's book, I'd somewhat amend the script because there's more information. But there's a limit to how much you can put in a film. I mean, the film only runs a bit under 2 hours. You can't put you've got to concentrate on the characters and the crux of the story of what it is you're telling. You've got to really keep your mind on that. But I haven't seen that film since 1980. Really? I don't watch. Do you sit down and read your books you wrote years ago? But I don't watch films I've done in the past.
If I did a film like yours, I'd have 5 televisions all over the house, and it'd be just on a continuous spool. So wherever I was, I'd just look at it. One of my researchers, I mentioned Dr. Libby Effney, she's encouraged me over the years to tell more of the female side of the stories, so that, not just focusing on the male part. And the 2 characters that I really enjoyed trying to bring to life in the book was Emily Hobhouse, who was this English activist who goes there and sees the English concentration camps and is shocked and goes back to England and blows the whistle.
She was a very admirable figure.
Yeah. And the other one I loved was, her name was Annie Boyter. And she was the wife of one of the last standing Boer generals, Louis Boyter, and basically got him by the ear and dragged him to the peace table. And she went back and forth between the lines to bring Boyter and Kitchener to the one table at the one time. And really, at one point, she's arrested by the English. And they said, well, we're going to have to put you back on that train. And she said, well, if I get back on that train, it'll be blown up. And they said, how do you know? And said, well, my husband's going to blow it up. They said, well, he won't blow it up if we've got you on the front carriage. And we tell everybody, and they put her on the front carriage, put it out there. And so they didn't blow up the train.
It's funny, Bruce, about not watching your own film. I remember when I
watched it. See, I see it so many times when I'm editing it.
Why wouldn't you watch it? I mean, you haven't watched it in 40 years?
I haven't. No.
Brilliant.
He's right, it is.
You know, you were saying before, one of you was saying that if you sometimes look at films that you admired years ago and you think, oh God, why did I like that? You mentioned the Rocky films. And I keep thinking, oh, look at my old films, I'll just get depressed. It's better to go forward.
What about, if I may ask, what about Driving Miss Daisy? Surely you've seen that.
I haven't seen it since we made it, no.
This is not uncommon. This is not uncommon. I remember talking to Tim Winton
Mm.
when they were making a TV series of Cloud Street. And he said to me, oh, I had to reread it. And when I started rereading it, I realized I'd forgotten almost all of it.
Yeah.
A lot of people just,
It
as
is.
you say, they move on.
Yes, it's better to keep going. I mean, I'm thinking about projects that I've got coming up.
You
I
get
hope
emo-
I've
you
got
get-
coming up.
You get emotionally exhausted, and something I found in this at the moment, even though we're talking about Breaker Morant, my head is filled with Jorn Utzon at the Opera House, and it's interesting because at the time, at the end of a book, I know it all backwards and forwards and dates and times, and then I move on to the next book, and my head's populated by it, so it's hard to recall all the stuff. But I'm stunned that you've done
Okay.
films as good as yours and you don't see them.
Well, sometimes I'll turn the TV on and one of them will be on and I'll look at a few minutes. But I might look at it 2 or 3 minutes, but I don't
But
keep watching.
What
it.
about Mrs. Beresford? Does she not insist that you sit down and watch?
No, she doesn't. I mean, but
So one of the things you do in your book, Peter, is you explode a few Breaker Morant myths, and you also give a lot more space than I've seen in the past to subsidiary characters in the story. And there's one I want to talk to each of you about, and that is Alfred Taylor,
Hmm.
right?
Bastard.
Who was also charged. There were 6 people charged, I believe, including the three main ones that we know.
yes,
Morant,
that's right.
Hancock, and Witten. There were 3 others,
We simplified it in the film.
and one of those 3 was Alfred Taylor,
Hmm.
and he was brought to account first and acquitted.
Yes.
Now let's. I know you write a lot about him, but just tell the audience what you think about him.
Well, I mean, in the film, it's played very well by John Waters. I mean, Taylor was a sort of homme non squeeze who was another evil figure, but he managed to get himself out of everything. There's a lot more about him in the book than in the film.
I found him. I mean, when you're dealing with this, I try so many times, you get so many different characters, and some characters just leap from the page. And again, with my researchers, we have endless discussion between us about, and I quite like it when researchers take opposing views, like with Utzon at the moment, whether he was the world's greatest architect or he was a good sculptor. And my 2 researchers are quite opposed, and there's an intellectual tension where you try to get to the truth. But Percy Taylor was a murderous, racist, murderous, mongrel, Machiavellian man who was English and was constantly encouraging a culture. He was in intelligence, and there was this new concept within the British Armed Forces of intelligence. You have to have an intelligence man who can report on, this tribe's being difficult, this chief's trouble, how do we get it, what do we do, and giving advice. And Taylor was always had no official role to give orders to anybody like Morant or Captain Percy, Captain Hunt, Alfred Taylor and Percy Hunt. Alfred Taylor had no authority to do any. He was intelligence, and yet wherever he went, there was a trail of destruction behind him and murders. And all of these accounts that he would strike the fear into the Africans because he would shoot Africans, in front of the other tribes. You want to argue with me? You want to question me? Bang, and shoot them dead and drop them at his feet. Any more questions from any of you? He was that kind of a man. And yet when the law caught up with Breaker Morant and Hancock and that, Taylor, nowhere to be seen. He was not in the front. He had a quick trial early on and was let go and lived from memory to be a very old man.
79, I believe.
At the end of the film, there's a short epilogue with the titles of some of the characters, and it made it clear that Taylor actually came out of it unscathed and went on living in South Africa.
As you write in the book, the reaction to him getting off for Morant and Hancock and Whitten would be, well, they'll get off too then.
Yeah.
So how did that not happen?
And they tried. See, the other thing that is always they're accused of, it's always said, and the defenders of Morant to this day, 120 years on, say, you know, he was given orders. He was following orders by Kitchener to shoot the prisoners. You know, it was all Kitchener's fault. I am not a admirer of Kitchener, you know, in terms of a lot of other stuff that went on. Really, there were orders from Kitchener. Well, that's strange, because in the month that all the atrocities were registered under Breaker Morant, that we're meant to believe that he was following Kitchener's orders, the Bushveld Carbineers, the unit that Morant was fighting and commanding at the end, they took in 100 prisoners. There were 1,000 prisoners a week coming in of the Boers at this time. So you would think these orders from Kitchener, they would be apparent somewhere, they would show up somewhere. And why, if these orders were there from Kitchener, I would love Kitchener to, you know, if for the storytelling purposes, I would love to have found, and I must say, hundreds of hours of research went into trying to find the Kitchener orders. They don't exist, and it doesn't make sense that they exist, because if they existed, we wouldn't have 1,000 prisoners a week of Boers coming in, filling up their concentration camps.
Yes, I never found any evidence of any orders from Kitchener's. I was glad that you didn't, actually. I was reading the book. I thought, oh, maybe he comes up with something, but no.
Did you
quite the
love
reverse.
Churchill and Gandhi and those other characters?
Yes.
Fascinating that Churchill should be there. And at one point,
Yeah.
Churchill's coming down a hill and Gandhi's going up.
Yes. It was interesting. That's what I said in my review of the book, that it had an all-star cast.
Including Van Gogh's brother.
Van Gogh's brother.
And Rudyard Kipling.
Yes. And of course, the South African writer, the one who wrote Olive Schreiner.
Yes, who was a peace activist. And at one point, Banjo Patterson sits at a dinner beside Rudyard Kipling. And the fact that Rudyard Kipling knows some of Banjo Patterson's verse, Banjo's very pleased. And I was fascinated with Banjo Patterson, that in one of my books, Gallipoli, you see Charles Bean, the great Sydney Morning Herald war correspondent, heads off the war, more English than the English, believing in this war and believing that the English are superior to the Australians, and comes back and he's more Australian than the Australians. And it's the beginning of understanding. And Banjo Patterson similarly goes over as the Sydney Morning Herald war correspondent, believing the Boers, all the propaganda, the Boers are hairy monsters. And one of the first Boers he meets beats him at billiards. It was a Boer prisoner, and they discuss, you know, matters intellectual and artistic into the night, which is his first realization. The Boers are like us. They speak a different language, but they're decent people. And by the end of the war, he comes back and he starts giving lectures and writing poetry saying, what the hell are we doing in the Boer War? This is not a fight that we should be a part of.
All right, we're coming to the end of our time. So I'm going to ask you one of those sort of typically journalistic questions right now.
Me.
Each of you, and you're first.
Go on.
You're the judge in a courtroom. Before you is Breaker Morant and Ned Kelly. You can let one of them off. Which one do you let off?
That would be a very tricky question. Probably Ned Kelly, rather reluctantly.
But why? Why?
Well, I don't think he was shooting unarmed prisoners and children.
You've written a book on Ned Kelly.
I
Your
have.
verdict?
I was being interviewed by Neil Mitchell, and it really went well for 25 minutes. And then a policeman called up and he said, how dare you write about Ned Kelly, the cop killer, and make him out to be a hero? To which my answer was quite impassioned. I said, I'm not writing anything about Ned Kelly being a good man or a bad man. I'm saying this is what happened. This is what he did. And there are 2,000 footnotes that say this is what happened. You can draw your conclusions either way. That said, Ned Kelly, exactly as Bruce said, he didn't kill children. You know, he was convicted. The whole thing boiled down to Stringy Bar Creek, the killing of the two policemen at Stringy Bar Creek. And I wrote a lot about the widows of the policemen that were killed. But Ian Jones, who was the great doyen, the great expert on Ned Kelly, who helped me a great deal in that book, he made the point, and here is the truth of Ned Kelly. If Ned Kelly had wanted to kill those policemen, Ned Kelly had the capacity to shoot the cigarette out of a kookaburra's mouth at 150 yards on a dark night. He could do it. He could have killed those policemen without trouble. He didn't. He raced out of the bush with the guns coming forward, and he said, drop your weapons, we've got you covered, we've got you covered. One policeman dropped his weapon, the other, Constable Lonigan, went for his gun, and Ned Kelly dropped him tragically. But in terms of bad men, you know, Ned Kelly, one of my favourite lines about Ned Kelly, the guy that plays him at Beechworth, I said, you played him for 25 years, you've read everything about him. What do you make of him? And he said he was somewhere between a heroic villain and a villainous hero. And I think with Breaker Morant, he was a charming, loquacious, charismatic, murderous mongrel dog.
Well, that's not a bad way to finish, I think. So Peter is now working on a book, as he mentioned, on the Opera House and Jorn Utzon. I believe this should be your next film. You can stay here and make it.
Oh, the one.
Huh?
Can you get me a big budget?
I don't know if I can do that. I could make some casting suggestions, though. Max von Sydow's not around anymore, is he?
Unfortunately not.
He would have been great as Jorn. But one of those other, that family, the young one plays Tarzan, but the older one, that Swiss family of actors.
There's plenty of good Scandinavian actors around these days.
So I think we've got a deal here. Okay.
Tell us to finish, if I can ask, what's the best film ever made?
Oh, the best film ever known. You know, it's a very difficult question. I would put a trilogy, the Patha Panchali trilogy, done by Satyajit Ray, Indian director. You can get these films on DVD and you are going to be stunned.
All over Australia now, people are going to record that. What did he say? What was the name of the film? What was the name of the director? Thank you, Stephen, for having us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Bruce. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks to all of the audience for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it.